Welcome to the Neomedieval Ledger. I'm Samuel Dempsey. In the relentless churn of global crises, from Ukraine to Gaza to Sudan, some horrors risk fading from view not because they've ended, but because our attention has simply moved on. Chief among these is the plight of the ethnic minorities in China. And it doesn't help when media soundbites like this are catching fire online.
There are a lot of rumors about China. There's a lot of misunderstandings and also just outright lies, and that it's just another normal country, just like every other country.
Hasan Piker, who is a behemoth of political influence online, one of the most viewed streamers, and recently at CrookedCon, has made his trip to China a mission to whitewash the atrocities that are currently unfolding at the hands of the CCP. His decision to do so embodies the moment we are in, where many that were on the fringe are now mainstream, and in which many issues that don't fit the right-left, east-west binary are caught in the crosshairs. To piece through this and get back to the reality of the situation, I spoke with Alerk Ablikim, the founder of Alerkin Consulting, a strategic advisory firm whose very name derived from Alerkin, meaning grab the freedom. This alone signals his unwavering commitment to human rights in the face of authoritarian repression. He's not only spent years documenting and combating what many governments now recognize as genocide, China's systemic destruction of Uyghur culture and identity in Xinjiang, but who, like most Uyghurs, is personally affected by the atrocities of the CCP. We touch on important conversations surrounding the Uyghurs, Tibetans, Hongkongers, and the challenges they face being entangled in geopolitical contest and conquest, and discuss what leverage we actually have left when sanctions have failed and the surveillance technology from Xinjiang has now been exported globally. It's an important conversation that I'm grateful to have had with Alerk. Alerk, thank you so much for being on the show today. It's a real pleasure to have you. So,
thanks for having me.
When we first met some years ago, there was significant global attention on the plight of the ethnic minorities in China, most of all, the genocide of the Uyghurs. And then we have the invasion of Ukraine, the genocide in Gaza, Sudan, the Congo, so on and so forth. There's an explosion of massive humanitarian crises throughout the world. And then it feels like there seems to be very little attention put forward for the issues facing ethnic minorities in China. So has the reality of people actually changed on the grounds every day, or is the media cycle simply just kind of moved on from this issue?
It's a very good question. I want to first maybe focus on the media part, because there are two distinct elements to this. For a long time, I myself thought, maybe accepted the fact that there wasn't any attention to it. After that peak period around 2019 until 2021. Yeah. And that's because, in a way, I do believe that the news isn't there to educate you about things in the world. The news is there to report on things that are new. And once something is already recorded, it loses kind of the acute situation to get it reported. But as you have mentioned quite clearly, there are lots of things happening in the world, and we're kind of also getting fatigued of all the things that are happening. And the situation with the Uyghurs, but also with Tibetans and also other peoples in China, it's so different from other conflicts in the world because we don't get this continued media supply in a way. Yeah. There are no bombs, there are no drone videos, there's no access to a lot of places. It's just happening. And then maybe coming back to what's happening on the ground. So what you saw at the start of 2017 is that massive group of people in the order of millions were taken into what are called vocational re-education centers. And the idea was that people should be, in a way, Sinicized. The idea was to reform them, but that meant Sinicization. And at first, it was kind of Sinicization with all the practices of repression and brutal policies.
And real quick, just to make sure the audience is clear on what you're saying Sinicization, you're saying basically forcing these ethnic minorities to conform to the un-Chinese ethnic group.
Sure. China as a country are historically known as a state that has this state necessity to homogenize the population. You can see in mainland China that it has been quite effective. There are lots of different people with lots of different languages they speak, Cantonese, Hokkien, Hakka, whatever. And they have been successfully, in a way, put back or put into this mold, which is dominated by the major ethnic group, which is the Han Chinese ethnic group. And at some point, it kind of broadened into, for example, the Manchus, but the Manchus have almost disappeared. And what you saw is that in the peripheries, where the Uyghurs and the Tibetans live, and to a certain extent also the Mongolians in southern or inner Mongolia, you saw that campaign was less successful. So there had to be many more resources put in to make this practice perhaps succeed. And what you saw in 2014 when Xi Jinping came to power is that there was a decision to be made that the state would have this leading central role in doing this. Before, you still had the Cultural Revolution under Mao, but there was this idea after that that the Uyghurs would at some point become Chinese if they were taken into the state structure of the Chinese state, with of course the discrimination between against ethnic groups. But there was an idea that people could study in the East, they would be part of let's say East society. That's the idea was that didn't succeed. I think the tipping point was 2009. Of course, in 2008 they had the big Olympic Games to show China to the world and present it as a world power. But already in 2008 there was a massive protest in Tibet, which was brutally put down. In 2009 there was a protest in Urumqi, which they also put down. And in 2014, that decision was made. And at some point, if you want to reform people or mold them back into this homogenized state, you have a group that you deem to be unreformable. And those people were taken out of society. So that was kind of the start of the campaign. But what you see with most genocides, human rights violations, once you have this state structure that is based on violence, is that at some point it kind of escalates. So what happened is that you had millions of people in camps, you could put them to work, and you had forced labor. And China also always had this presentation on forced labor on their own population as this new kind of human rights, the right to labor or right to work, whatever they call it, and therefore individual human rights can be sacrificed, so people can be killed apparently. But that idea was kind of shifted towards the ethnic groups. And so first the concentration camps or the vocational re-education centers, then the labor camps. And what you saw is that there needed to be some kind of structure outside of those camps to put people, to make people stay within that mold, to force people to stay within that mold.
Yeah, and so help me understand kind of logistically for like the goals of the CCP in doing this, what this looks like over time, because this is a very complex genocide, as you're saying. This is not something that we can watch unfold in real time through bombs and drones and whatever it may be. So it sounds like what you're saying is they're basically taking the majority of the working population and trying to isolate them, put them to use for the goals of the state. And at the same time, where does that leave those, I would assume mostly women and children, that are not put into these camps per se? Is it, I heard stories when I was reporting on this before that there'd be, they'd be forced to marry, people that were from the CCP or Han Chinese, trying to kind of like, water them down to lose their ethnic and cultural identity over time. And then of course, forced sterilization as well. So is that kind of the means that is taking form outside of these camps to make sure that this is not a genocide that's going to happen in this lifetime, but that's just that over time, there will no longer be an Uyghur people through these different ways?
Exactly. So the initial goal was, of course, pacification. But pacification is this, say, insecurity that you can never resolve with any means. So the pacification anxiety will only be solved with kind of the elimination of the other, which is in this case the Uyghurs. And you're saying is correct. So there are lots of people who are outside of the camps. Like women are also taken into the camps. There are camps for women, and there is a sterilization campaign. So for people outside and inside the campaign. So what China calls Xinjiang, which the Uyghurs call East Turkestan. Xinjiang means new frontier in Chinese, which is kind of its colonial name. By itself as well, is that they already had a state structure with the one-child policy of controlling childbirth. And they just applied that full force to groups that were, to a certain degree, back in the day, exempt from this law, but then completely put on that. And what you saw is that they were getting temporary sterilizations or childbirth means, and the second stage was permanent sterilization. And you saw that in Xinjiang, the population plummeted. So the Uyghurs will eventually die out in that sense. And what you mentioned, marrying Han Chinese men was also a campaign. There were lots of settlers from mainland China coming over, partly also to work in the camps, because you have to have a lot of people to manage that, but also this encouraged change of the demographic makeup within the region. And you had this whole twin family thing. So you would, once you're outside of the camps, you had this surveillance state, but then you would have people that are coming into your house, depending on how safe your family is to be deemed, and they live with you. They have to eat with you, they have to sleep with you, they check whether you're complying with all the rules. So you sing the national anthem, you speak Chinese at home, you shouldn't pray, you shouldn't fast if it's Ramadan. So in that sense, it's a complete societal shift in, let's say, completely changing the minds of people. That's at least the attempt.
Walk me through the surveillance state that you're talking about. What does the day-to-day life of people then look like in this environment? And second part question to that is, like you're saying, this is not something live streamed online. How are you able to understand what this is like? Because obviously you yourself are Uyghur, and I assume you have these familiar connections that you're able to tap to. But even so, in a surveillance state, how does information translate in and out of that? And how are you able to understand and paint this picture as it's developing?
So from a journalistic kind of point of view on how to perceive the regions, there is quite a lot out there. It's just hard to get through all the mud, let's say, all the disinformation as well. And that's because the Chinese themselves promote it to a certain degree. So the Chinese sources themselves in their own propaganda reveals to a certain extent what they're doing. So it's quite a different picture to what we are presented with in the West with the disinformation campaigns. And what you see with surveillance state is that there are kind of two elements. There's the technological surveillance state, and then there's the physical ones. The physical ones are quite easy. There are checkpoints everywhere. As you can know from maybe the Palestinian experience, there are checkpoints every street. And you're only getting checked if you're Uyghur or one of the other Turkic peoples. And they can perceive that through a certain facial recognition software as well. And that facial recognition software is something that really came up around 2016, and China really fully implemented. In especially like Uyghur majority cities, every street has cameras and facial recognition software, and they have the digital database. They use AI nowadays to see who you are, what age you are, what family members you have. Is there any kind of risk attached to you? Which is also one of the reasons people were taken into those camps, where there was a myriad of reasons people could be taken in: having a beard, not drinking, not smoking, having traveled abroad, having contacts abroad. All those stuff were one of the risk signifiers. But that kind of applies to the current state of outside of those camps as well. And that facial recognition software is now being exported. It has been exported to a lot of authoritarian, but also, let's say,
Western democracies.
Exact democracies. So Turkey, wherever you can think of. There was a recent report on Turkey, and I made the kind of the cynical comment saying that, well, Turkish people would be easy to recognize because the software was tested on Uyghurs. And this is the difference between all the other facial recognition software. China has properly tested them. They have a population they want to test them on. They have a state structure, they have the funding, and they have the technological means to do something like this. And they have.
So I want to pivot now to a current kind of media frenzy online that I think is a little bit more familiar for you and I and the younger generation, digitally consumed by all of these absurd conversations. But, you know, in the last few weeks, we've seen Hasan Piker, who is a behemoth of political influence in the West. He has been doing what I will describe as a Chinese propaganda tour. That's the way I would put it. I think he shows it as showing the nuance that is China. But while he's doing it, he's not addressing and he's overlooking these human rights abuses that he himself once championed. So first, as someone personally connected to this, who's fighting for this, how does this make you feel just on an individual basis? But second, how do you respond to so many of his followers and people on the far left now who genuinely believe that because this issue of the ethnic minorities in China has been taken as a form of strategy for much of the right and the far right in the West to kind of say we're a better model, the East is bad, we need to have competition against China, so on and so forth. They then look at it as this is a Western fabrication, that because these bad actors have taken it for themselves, that therefore this issue itself doesn't fully exist. So firstly, on the personal note, how does this resonate with you? And then secondly, how do you then answer to these people that buy into these narratives of fabrication?
It's really frustrating, also quite painful. I see it in the part of, it's one of the bigger fish within the whole campaign that China wants, which is that influencers come to China, but also to the touristic places in East Turkestan, in Xinjiang, to kind of show off the parallel society they have created. Maybe then on the topic of how the far left may, the tankies, as they are called, may want to reduce, wants to kind of like to justify what's happening to Uyghurs and other groups. I'm myself a left-wing person, right? And I get into contact with these people quite often because you're in the same circles. And the frustrating thing about it is that on one hand, you want to believe their good-hearted nature. So you want to kind of apply the principle of charity to it and have this discussion. Okay, sure, okay, you're really much against Western imperialism, all the
Yeah.
wrong things that have been done, but you're looking at China or Russia or some other place in the world, and you're justifying a huge number of human rights violations and genocidal acts. How come you do that? And that first question will usually turn out either in a good way, then you can have this conversation and trying to change their minds. If you can't, then they're too much forced into this camp idea, which is that on the left, we have lost to the far right. On the far left has lost to the far right because they're still within a discourse of the far right. So they have decided that because the let's say America wants to fight against China in the next century, you are against all the things that America is doing wherever in the world. Therefore, you are going to be supporting or rooting for China. So this idea that there are camps in the world, but you're still within that discourse. You're not developing any ideas for yourself. You're also creating other groups. You're not believing in the universal principle of human rights, but outside of the universal principle of human rights, the human dignity, agency you give to people. So what I'm kind of afraid of is that the principle that left-wing people should have is, of course, the care for others with lesser means, but just others in the world, for humans in the world.
Exactly.
And that's, if that doesn't apply because you believe in this geopolitical fight or whatever you think, then you have lost being a left-wing person because you have lost empathy for people. So this is the difficulty with all the conflicts in the world. On the one hand, you have to understand it in the structural way. You want to have the context, you want to have the history, and you want to understand all the means. At the same time, you can't lose the human element to it. What is happening to individual people at that moment? They are real people.
Exactly. No, and I just want to touch on the real people aspect, because I think that's what's really hard about these online echo chambers that have been formed in this, current very volatile political environment, is that there's a very real tendency that I think we ignored as being fringe conspiratorial people for quite a while that is now becoming more and more mainstream, of the dehumanization of real people. Part of that is that when I've pushed back against these people and say, no, I've spoken to people repressed and tortured by this Chinese state, and they will respond with, no, those are CIA plants. This is all efforts of the National Endowment for Democracy or whatever. And so you're someone that can personally speak to being a voice, an activist, someone advancing this agenda with state and non-state actors trying to represent the interests of those affected by this. Can you walk me through how you've engaged or not engaged with Western forces or voices that are often put as to blame or the conspirators behind this fabricated agenda?
That's a very good question. It's usually quite easy to make that argument by finding the things they deem to be important and then showing the hypocrisy in there, and then it might open up some ways. For example, the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was demonized and used as this boogeyman by the United States. Doesn't mean the Soviet Union didn't commit all those wrongs. So it's quite easy like that. So maybe some history. Was born in Urumqi in 1999 and came to the Netherlands as a refugee in 2007. And since then, I tried to live this normal Dutch life, integrate within society, learn the language, etc. The path of any kind of people, asylum seeker you can find. The necessity for me to really, let's say, work for my community here in the Netherlands was that my father in 2017 was also taken. So my father is quite a famous poet. His name is Ablikim. And he was incarcerated, and in the first wave where all the intellectuals were, intellectuals, singers, etc., were taken in to be re-educated. Because if you can re-educate them, at least that was, I think, the idea, you can get the masses behind you. So I didn't know what to do, and at some point I decided to speak out. And I have this great fortune that I've been able to learn the language as well as stay connected to at least an element of my native culture. And that helped me kind of cross the bridges. And also when the real concentration camps came up and every single Uyghur lost family members, or at least didn't speak to them, didn't know what was happening to them, there was a need to kind of translate this to the proper authorities, to the government, to the media, and I could help with that. What I've eventually realized is that my role is a role of someone who can translate what's happening within our community to the Dutch society. And those two things don't always match. You have to be able to tell that story. In Western Europe, it's very hard to talk about, for example, genocide and kind of leave the mental bar that we have set, which is the Holocaust.
Yeah.
The reason it's a genocide is because of the population
Yeah.
control. And that is a genocide that we have not experienced yet. Every single genocide since Second World War was a war genocide in a way, which is based on pure violence. But the Second World War had two elements, which is the war itself and the mass incarcerations of Jews, Romani people,
Yep.
gay people, disabled people. So that those two things are not per se related. Of course, they're based on the element of violence, but they could have existed separately. And now we're seeing something that is not based on a war, which is a genocide, and people can easily comprehend. So my job is kind of trying to walk them through it. And it works all right, I think. Mostly with Western European people, the base principle is kind of faith and trust, because of their kind of naivety on proper oppression and brutality, you also expect them not to make bad faith arguments. They want to understand things, and I think I've been quite successful in telling this story to the Dutch population. But now you see that because of the whole fatigue in the world, the amount of horrendous things that are happening in the world, that people just don't want to know anything, and they don't trust or believe anything, which also social media has something to do with it. And that's very difficult. So yeah, that's a challenge we have to work on. And I think the solution to this, again, is to present a human element, like discussing with those people on whether it's a CIA back campaign or not. It doesn't bring back my father. It doesn't bring back anyone. Like the situation for us, the people who are affected, is not changing. So in that sense, at some point, you also have to kind of let it go. There's no point in having bad faith arguments with bots or propagandists.
Of course. And so who are the champions in the West of the plight that you're bringing forward to try to spread awareness about? Is it there specific political groups or communities or activist networks, or where are you best being received, I suppose is the question.
Of course, it always starts with the community itself. It's the diaspora community itself. They are the ones who have agency. You saw one in the peak of the news cycle in 2019 as well, that it was a lot of talk about the Uyghurs, but not very much with the Uyghurs. And maybe you're one of those people who did talk to Uyghurs, so that's big up for you. But yeah, so it starts with the community itself. The community has to be stable. We have gone through a lot of things here, and of course not as much as people there, but we are having a difficult time as well. And it's quite astonishing how resilient we have turned out to be to a certain degree. We are still here. We're trying to be who we are. We're trying to survive as well. So that is important. Then the second element is the political elites or the broader society. And when it comes to broader society, it can be received, but the problem is that I feel like we receive our political cues from, especially as the Dutch, from the transatlantic view, so from the United States. So if something happens in the US, we'll get a headline from it immediately. If something happens in China, we don't. And what I mean to say by this is that there's, of course, this idea of intersectionality. And intersectionality is good and important, very important, but we still, as humans, prioritize things. And that's all right. If someone wants to fight for women's rights, there's no need telling him or her that something else is also important. It's just whataboutism. But what I want to kind of highlight is that people should take into account, for example, China, the plight of the Uyghurs, the Tibetans. Bring that part of your, let's say, your efforts to change the world daily. See what's happening there as also a signifier or motivator for your own politics. Like, for example, Palestine is right now for a lot of people. So that's kind of what I'm trying to do with the broader society. When it comes to the political elites, you see that the narrative, in a way, the genocide, for example, was recognized by the Dutch parliament, but the Dutch government never accepted it because it would cost them a lot. There's a constitutional necessity to use every means to prevent or stop a genocide. That's how it's written. That's why the Palestine issue is also difficult for the Dutch government. But there was a political understanding, okay, this is happening. Now you see the shift into the securitization of this debate. So China is this threat, a security threat, this systemic rival, and we have to kind of have strategic autonomy. We want to reduce our dependence, etc., etc. Which is not per se a bad discourse to have, as long as you, of course, don't use the value of the humans themselves and human rights themselves. But the security argument, it's the difficulty for us in that sense is to implant ourselves as voices within also that security argument. So what we're trying to do is that when the large-scale invasion of Ukraine happened in 2021, there was this idea that Europe woke up, but it wasn't Europe that woke up, it was Western Europe that woke up.
Yeah, exactly.
Eastern European countries have been saying this since their existence. They know how it is to live under Russian oppression. So that's what we're trying to say as well, that there was this naive argument on China, but our voices were always there. They just didn't listen to us. We know how Chinese state apparatuses work. Most of us speak Chinese. We know how China works in the peripheries as well, especially those peripheries that are now enormously valuable because of the Belt and Road initiatives and the Global Gateway and Central Asia, etc. We can have a voice there. And it's up to them to listen to our voices with some merit as well, because we have lots of great academics, analysts that can analyze situation in China quite well from a different perspective.
And when we first spoke years ago, and like you said, it had more media attention, it felt, I think, like there was, the tides were turning a bit on China's ability to get away with this repression. And it seems like that feels less so to be the case now.
Yeah.
But I say all this that, at that time, I know that you and many in the Uyghur diaspora had their own safety in question, even being in safe havens in Europe or the United States or Canada and so on. And even I, reporting on this, I had Chinese hackers regularly.
Yeah.
I had to get my computer swiped and cleaned many times over. And I wonder, is that still the same reality for you all at this moment, or is China so confident that they are getting away with this that they don't even need to take these measures anymore?
No, they do take these measures, and maybe they are confident enough that they could get away with it. So they're it's called transnational repression, of course, which is this foreign government that wants to influence either diaspora or individuals in outside states. And this topic was something very important to us, and we have been working quite a lot on it in the Netherlands for a long time now, for 5-6 years. So one of the things that are now being set up this year is this hotline where people from different diasporic backgrounds can call a specific hotline to report instances of intimidation, and it would be coordinated and be put into the hands of the right people. The question is whether it will succeed in doing that, because it still has some problems, but at least we have a voice there. We're actively seeking more of a presence in developing this, but at least it's good there. The transnational repression issue from the Chinese side has only increased in importance. So if you look at Chinese documents themselves, the person that's the head of the diasporic or the United Front work is the right-hand man of Xi Jinping, the former mayor of Shanghai. And they are receiving an increased budget, I think $2 billion. We can verify. Yeah, but the importance for the Chinese themselves have increased as well. So they're, first of all, looking to influence the Chinese diasporas, the Han Chinese diasporas abroad. Even Han Chinese people have nothing to do with the Communist Party or with China, because they have migrated to any country so long ago. But then there's the second element to focus on Hongkongers, Uyghurs, Tibetans, but also Chinese LGBTI activists as well. So that group is increasingly under threat. And then there's this another layer, which is broader Western societies themselves, societies in general. So there was a Dutch journalist who had a fake bomb threat to her name. There's myriad of those issues where China is going to force broader societies outside of our groups to kind of bend to its will. So the active campaign to influence foreign states is only increased in value, I would argue.
Okay. And for those that are hearing this story and it's resonating with them and they want to be part of the better side of history and doing something about this, there was a lot of pressure years before on the role of a consumer and boycotting certain industries where the supply chains were built off of these human rights abuses. And now, as you talked about, a lot of the surveillance that has been trained and used on Uyghurs is now being exported elsewhere. And also there's Western companies that are now mimicking it the same way, using the same best practices learned there on domestic populations in the West. And so I say this to say that it feels like the scale of this issue has only grown. It feels like the supply chain is more intertwined despite these sanctions that have been levied. It feels like they have not been as impactful as many hoped. And then also there's been kind of a surrender from the West to even be opposed to this model in many ways. So what meaningful leverage exists now for listeners to actually express impactful concern on this issue?
I think from that moment on, in 2019 already, the chances that China would stop its genocidal campaign because of divestment or boycotts were already limited. So the idea was that if they are going to have this massive state apparatus where millions of people are locked up and it costs a lot of money, at least not be responsible for that. So not co-financing situation there. So there's still a moral argument to be made to divest. In that sense, from perspective now, it's still important what consumers do because the consumer is quite powerful here.
Yep.
They have a lot of money. I eventually, at the end of the day, I do truly believe it's governments that should step in. And
Okay.
because the consumer is to one extent not as knowledgeable on everything that's happening. And on the second hand, they have this apathy. So, for example, fast fashion, for example, the Uyghur forced labor, slavery is in almost every supply chain when it comes through China. So in that
Yeah.
sense, it's almost everywhere. But when it comes to fast fashion, you shouldn't need the genocide in the Uyghurs to have as a reason not to buy fast fashion.
Yeah.
Fast fashion is bad in general without our situation going on. But people
Yeah.
will still do it. So that's, I think, the difficulty of this. But then coming back to the government argument, the US had this Uyghur Forced Labor Act, which put the responsibility on companies themselves to look at their supply chains and to prevent
Yeah.
Uyghur forced labor, which is a pretty powerful law. And then the European answer to this, at least what we worked on, was the CSDDD and the CSRD. And you can explain that much better than me, I think, but the omnibus package has made that completely dead. Just a shell of itself, and it was already a weak thing.
And so that's kind of I think the main mechanism that people still have right now is that, electeds are not following through on these promises that have been made or are currently being made. They're rolling back much of this. And so really it comes down to all of us as normal people to pressure our politicians. And most of all, when it comes time to campaign and earn that vote.
Exactly. And understand what this means as well. Understand what it means that this random law, maybe in European Union or in any national parliament, getting shot down by the far right. It seems like such a pattern, but understand what it truly means. That in supply chains in the world, there's human rights violation, environmental violation that are essential to our survival. And if you reduce or just completely destroy this, it will just cause so much havoc in the world. This one law could work, at least it won't solve everything perfectly, but it would be such a good step in at least putting more to law in a way that we are a union based on normative values, on human rights, on all those things. But the hypocrisy will continue, and that will also reduce any kind of standing that we have with the global South, with countries I need in the future.
And so I want to close with, you've talked about your work you're doing representing these interests in, with the Dutch parliament, with the Dutch government. And I want to ask you about the barriers and opportunities you face in doing this in the day-to-day work. But most of all, where are you finding hope to affect change in this in your everyday?
Right. So my current work is that I have my own company called Alerkin Consulting, and I am the political consultant for a myriad of groups, but a coalition of Uyghurs, Tibetans, Hongkongers, and Southern Mongolians. And I think what's unique in the Netherlands is that we are maybe the first country that have properly unified our advocacy work. And it has produced quite a lot of results, I feel like, within limits of what can be expected. And that is because we are stronger together, and we are all facing the same situation to different degrees. But yes, we are all facing the same state that has the same interest, etc. And this has caused us to be quite flexible when it comes to talking to, for example, Dutch parliamentarians, because all parliamentarians choose their own important topics. They have that freedom. They are representatives of the people. But because you are such a coalition, you can just make them interested in specific topics that are good for all of us, but maybe in this case specifically tied to one group or one issue. There are some people who are very much interested in Hong Kong, maybe in sanctions evasions that are going through Hong Kong. Other people are much more interested in Tibetans with the dams, environmental topics. And again, others are, for example, much more interested in Islamophobia, for example. Unfortunately, not that many, but that could also be used. So you have a lot of tools in your tool set to do this work. And my hope is that we just had an election. It has been understood, I think, slightly incorrectly by the rest of the world, which is that the far right was defeated. The far right wasn't defeated. They are bigger, but they have been splintered into different parties. There will be hopefully a government from the center itself, and that will produce a lot of opportunities because those are the people we have been already talking to for a long time. And what we want is just a new kind of China strategy. We want to help the Dutch, but also broader European countries into understanding how China works and including human rights within that China strategy, but also having this proactive stance against China that actually works. And the last week with with the Dutch government when it comes to the Nexperia. Nexperia is a chip company that is the only one in Europe that produces certain kind of chips, but part of their production is in China. And because they were funneling intellectual property to China, as well as planning to close the only European factory, the Dutch government stepped in. And the Dutch government stepped in. The Chinese got really angry, stopped all exports to Europe. And then the Germans got really angry because they didn't have any chips for their cars. And now he's backtracking. So he has given back control to the owner, the CEO and the owner, the Chinese owner of the company, as kind of this olive branch to the Chinese to give us back our chips because we need it so much. But it just proves that we're completely dependent. We have completely lost this battle. It means that in the future, if any Chinese red lines, which always increase over time, come up, that we are always in a submissive position. And the first red lines that are always going to be sacrificed is the situation of Uyghurs, Tibetans, Hongkongers. So that's the anxiety that I was talking about. The Chinese are so anxious for the groups to, I don't know, have some kind of autonomy, that they will force this as the major red line, which will cause the governments here to not dare raise a finger against anything that's happening. So that's kind of the bleak part. The work goes on.
But what I understand that offers a lot of hope is that, as much as there's the decline of the far right or the concentration of power within the center left, the better served these interests will be in affecting change and having levers. And I do think, the one thing I would pose as a hopeful outlook, at least how I look at the Dutch election, is that the far right, did not decline by numbers, but it declined in power by nature of it's now fragmented to some capacity. And I think that's kind of the hopeful part I think I see across many different national political discussions, is that the far right is a lot of infighting right now. There's a lot of extremists that is pulling folks apart. And so hopefully it means that the center and the left can actually push forward these agendas effectively in the next few years to come. But, we gotta stay hopeful.
I hope so, but I may want to add one maybe less hopeful note.
Sure. Yeah, go ahead.
Which is that it is, I agree, it's very good that this is happening. But what's in the future may be happening if the center consolidates and have to work together, there will be only two binary choices, which is the center or the far right. And the center now is, in a way, never going to solve the problems that initially caused people to go to the far right, which is all the issues of globalization and individual, the lack of community, social inequality, all those things. Yeah. And that's not going to get solved. And the unfortunate part is that why is there no left-wing option, right? We have become the system, which is not per se bad, but there needs to be a better story. And I always argue that the far right isn't nationalist anymore, because the far right uses the symbolism of nationalism, but they are much more connected with each other, transnationalists, than they are with their fellow countrymen that are maybe on the left. So we kind of treat them as this nationalist parties like before, but they're not. They're transnational and ideological party that are mobilizing people. So we need to have this counter and understanding of what's happening here as well.
No, exactly. And that's a primary objective of what I'm trying to do here at this podcast, is that there is a MAGA export of this make Europe great again model now that we're seeing. Heritage Foundation has moved in. We have Orban's think tank MCC here in Brussels. That's the second most funded political think tank in the city. The influence and the transnational shift of power that we're seeing to the right is very evident, and it's happening. Hopefully, despite that growth, we A, can spread awareness, and B, expect. I mean, I think it was an Atlantic headline yesterday that was like, this administration, I should find it, but it was like, this administration is run by a bunch of children in coats, it was basically like incompetent children masquerading as statesmen or something like this.
Right.
And I do think that is an important message to continue to deliver home, that much of these far right actors, while they are connected, while they are motivated, they are not very effective. And they're not very effective too at using government once they had it, which is obviously part of the issue that we saw with the far right in the Netherlands, that they got their limelight for a moment and achieved nothing with it. So as long as that continues forward and we can count on them to be incompetent.
There's always hope. Whatever the situation is, there's always hope.
Yes, indeed. Well, Alerk, thank you so much for taking the time, and thank you for being willing to not only share your expertise and the work you're doing, but share your personal experience on this. Because it is truly, it's a trying thing. And, as much as it is challenging, it is also, I think, such an important thing to do, to share, what you're experiencing and how it feels in the personal end, because, it feels far away, like you're saying, for many folks. And that story will resonate through everyone who hears it, and it will affect the change needed. So thank you so much for doing that. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me, Samuel. It's good to talk to you again.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, well, we'll do it again soon. Definitely.
Exactly. Not 5 years.
No, not 5 years. Thank you for listening to this conversation. If you enjoyed this episode, if it brought you value, then please like, subscribe, share with your network. And as always, if you have comments, concerns, or suggestions, here's my email, analysis@samuel-dempsey.com. With that, I hope to see you at next week's episode.